The mail-order bride brought 2 sisters. The mountain man selected all 3. The state auction clerk barely looked up when Dr. Laura Bennett bid $300 for the cave house by Lake Calo Basin. A laugh skimmed the room. She signed anyway, hands steady, heart ruined. By dusk, the mountain took her in. The house wasn't built so much as absorbed, an iron door swallowed by granite, windows narrow as eyelids. A chimney fused to basalt like a scar that healed wrong. The lake below lay too smooth, refusing the wind, reflecting a sky already bruising. Sophie slept in the passenger seat, hugging a backpack of seabed fossils her father once collected. Michael's name lived on Laura's tongue like a warning she wouldn't speak. She stepped out and heard it, not sound but pressure, a low, patient pulse tapping at her teeth every 27 seconds. Old reflexes ran the math. Grief told her to stop. Inside, dust lifted as if startled. Mineral smell, cold metal, and the sweet trace of something floral she couldn't place threaded the air. The cave walls bore drill scars she didn't recognize. On a shelf sat instruments older than her career, their needles trembling though the room was utterly still. A leather field journal waited under a stone, stamped with a name she hadn't allowed in months. Dr. Elias Warner. The iron door sighed shut. In the quiet, the pulse aligned with her heartbeat, then overtook it. A thin draft moved against the wind, flowing from deeper within the rock. Sophie murmured from the car, "Mom, the water's breathing." Laura, who had mapped faults for a living, found a map tucked behind a cracked photograph. Michael's hand-drawn routes, and a single notation in red. "Don't go alone." She lifted a lantern, watched its flame lean toward the corridor, and followed. What she found inside would change her life forever. Rain threaded the switchbacks like silver wire as Laura steered the Subaru up the mountain road, wipers working at a patient tempo that failed to catch the drifting mist. Pines crowded the grade, glossy with rain, their trunks black as wet rope. Gravel hissed under the tires, then softened where the shoulder turned to moss. A buck lifted its head from the ditch, watched with candle-bright eyes, and vanished into the brush without sound. Sophie slept against the window, breath fogging a pale oval that cleared. They had left the highway hours earlier, trading lines on a map for a narrow ribbon that bent along the spine of Lake Calo Basin. Laura cracked the window and let damp air rinse the car. It tasted of iron, sap, and something floral she could not place, a sweetness that seemed to come from stone rather than soil. She kept her speed low, memory replaying the auction room's fluorescent light, the clerk's shrug when her $300 bid landed, the quiet after the gavel tapped. Ownership felt unreal in the thickening weather, a decision that might dissolve if it were examined from the wrong angle. The final hairpin opened onto a cliffside turnout, and the house came into view, not built so much as revealed. The facade blended with the mountain, geometry carved into basalt. An iron-banded door sat within an arched recess. Windows were slender slits, eye narrow and watchful. The roofline dissolved into rock, making the dwelling feel like a hollow in a giant's rib. Below, the lake lay unnaturally still, a sheet of black glass refusing the wind. Rain dimpled the shoulder, yet the surface held itself smooth, as if movement had been negotiated away. Laura parked beneath an overhang where stone jutted like a frozen wave. The engine ticked as heat bled into the damp. She cut the headlights, and darkness settled with a weight that felt deliberate. Beneath the rain, another sensation rose, not sound precisely, more like gentle pressure against the bones behind her ear. It built, lingered, and ebbed with a rhythm slower than breath. Old reflexes began counting without permission, 27 seconds between swells. Her throat tight. She told herself it was water seeking seams or wind tunneling across the cliff face, and yet the cadence felt intentional, like a measured reminder. Sophie stirred when Laura touched her shoulder. "Are we there?" the girl asked, voice blurred by sleep. "We are," Laura said, forcing brightness. "Home." The word landed with an echo she felt in her ribs. They stepped out into cold drizzle. The air smelled of wet metal and crushed needles, threaded with a faint sweetness that persisted even as gusts shoved the forest scent around them. Sophie tipped her head toward the lake. "It looks like plastic," she said, like it forgot how to ripple. Laura followed her gaze and felt a small unreasonable shiver. It looked staged, like a photograph laminated over death. The door resisted when Laura turned the iron ring, then yielded with a long exhale, hinges complaining in a voice that suggested years without use. Their footsteps spread thinly through a stone corridor, the sound oddly dry. The entry broadened into a main room whose walls had been cut rather than faced, curved planes meeting clean angles, tool marks smoothed to a satin sheen. A slit window sent a pale stripe down one wall and dust glittered within it like falling mica. The hum persisted, gentle, not threatening but undeniably present, like a neighbor breathing on the other side of a common wall. Laura carried in boxes while Sophie explored the perimeter, palms skimming the cool surface as if greeting a patient animal. Shelves had been carved into the rock and finished like furniture. A basin sink sat within a counter hewn from a single block. Under the lantern's circle the stone looked warm, almost soft. On a table rested a small analog hygrometer, needle quivering though no draft kissed its face. Beside it lay a frayed lanyard clipped to a metal badge holder, empty. A ghost of a rectangle on the table showed where something had sat for a long time and was only recently removed. In the kitchen alcove, she found a drawer stuck by swollen wood. When it finally gave, a set of brittle papers sighed upward. Property transfer documents in stiff envelopes bore an institutional seal. A covering letter named a previous trustee, Dr. Elias Warner. The signature crawled across the page in a hand she recognized from conference programs and journal acknowledgments. Warner had been a rumor in their marriage, an outline around stories Michael told and then stopped telling. The date of the transfer placed the place squarely in the years when Michael was away in the field more than he was home, returning with a quiet that seemed to glow along the edges. Laura set the documents aside and stood very still. She remembered submitting her resignation, the way she typed the subject line 3 times before pressing send, how her finger shook over the key. Personal reasons. She had written an umbrella phrase that covered a storm. Meetings, field stations, graduate students with bright questions. She had loved all of it until the day language went simple. Accident, missing, retrieval. After that, every waveform became a tombstone rub. She boxed her notes, copied files to an archive she would not open, and turned in the ID that once got her through every locked door on campus. Sophie's voice floated from the window slit. The rain hits everything except the middle, she said. Watch. Laura joined. Droplets stippled the granite lip and darkened the cliff face, yet the expanse below refused texture. In the glass flat reflection, clouds slid past with cinema clarity. A pale bloom pulsed under the surface, not lightning, not moonlight, more like a breath trapped a layer down. The pressure in Laura's skull rose, then softened and rose again. She timed it without wanting to. The count matched the earlier rhythm, the same patient interval, as though water and stone shared a metronome. They arranged a small camp on the stone floor, unrolled sleeping bags and set a ring of tea lights to warm the space. The glow pressed shadows into corners and made the walls' curves gentle. Sophie placed a line of fossils along the sill, spiral ammonites. A shark tooth sharp as a memory. A slab of agate that caught and held the flame. Do you think Dad would have liked it? She asked without looking up. Laura considered the truth's shape. He would have taken out a notebook before he put down his pack, she said, which honored him without promising safety. Sophie nodded, satisfied by that imagined sequence. Checking the pantry, Laura found a recessed panel disguised as shelving. It clicked when she pushed the lowest plank. Behind it, a shallow utility space held a breaker box and coiled cable. A small bench stood nearby, scarred by the tips of metal tools. On it sat an old field notebook stamped with a university crest, empty except for a name penciled on the inside cover. Warner. No first name, just that steady surname, written once, underscored. Tucked in the pocket was a map sketched in ink, notations in a tight, upright hand. Arrows pointed toward the cliff face and a corridor labeled with careful carets. The hum thickened while she read, as if the house approved of attention. Sophie drifted toward sleep, lashes casting tiny shadows across her cheeks. Laura carried the map to the mantel. A cracked photograph leaned there. A beach, sun flare, Michael laughing, Sophie small and damp with salt. Behind the frame, a yellow corner she slid out a single sheet stamped with a defunct lab's letterhead. Bullet points marched down the page, narrow band resonance, cavity coupling, behavioral response, and a softer line at the bottom curved in Michael's handwriting. A half-joke paired with a warning only she would hear full. She folded the page and tucked it into her jacket pocket, then pressed her palm to the wall beside the hearth. Heat leached from the stone, faint, surprising. Hello, she said under her breath, embarrassed to hear the word. The pressure rose again, measured and patient. Outside, the lake held the mountain's reflection without blinking. Somewhere above, Wind pushed through fir and larch, yet the hollow around them felt sealed, a held breath between beats. Laura sat beside her daughter and let stillness settle, the hum pacing their new beginning like a clock buried in bone. Morning seeped into the cave house as a dim wash through the slit windows, softening edges and muting colors until the carved walls looked almost velvet. Laura woke to a measured push at her cheekbones, pressure rising and ebbing with the patience of a tide. 27 seconds, her trained mind noted, and she told it to rest. Sophie slept in her bag, arm draped over the agate she had lined on the sill like a small guardian. Beyond the stone lip, the lake held a flawless mirror, an eye refusing to blink. She lit the stove, brewed coffee and listened to the lantern tick as it cooled while the faint hum paced the room. The air tasted of iron and wet pine threaded with a sweetness that seemed to come from stone rather than soil. With rope, flashlight, painter's tape and the folded map in her pocket, she started a slow loop through the rooms, palms grazing seams and curves. Precision cut every surface, yet imperfect whispers hid behind polish, a cooler band along one wall, a thread of draft where none should exist. On her first pass she inventoried ordinary things. A rusted kettle near the basin, a crate of canned peaches buckled by age, a chair with a split rung. On her second she found the ordinary arranged strangely, scratches at equal intervals along decorative shelves, a corridor ending in a wall too clean as if a door had been sanded flush. The pulse kept time whether she wanted it or not, stepping up through the floor until speculation felt impolite. Sophie padded after her, hair tangled into a fox's tail, cheeks pale with the solemnity of restless travel. "It's louder," she whispered. Laura listened. The pressure blossomed above the dining alcove, faded and returned with the same calm certainty. "Rock does that," she said lightly. "Water finds tiny tunnels. Wind squeezes through. Air compresses. Think of a flute, but slow." Sophie nodded without conviction and drifted to the window slit, watching the lake's unnatural poise. Behind kitchen shelving, the panel she had found last night yielded with a practiced click. The utility recess felt cooler, the air faintly sweet as if an unseen flower had opened inside stone. Coiled cable gleamed, uncommonly clean. On a scarred bench sat a metal case no larger than a tackle box, clasps wrapped in black tape. Laura eased it open. Foam-cradled instruments. A portable geophone with spidery leads, a pencil-thin probe, a battered multimeter, a compact oscillograph rubbed to matte. Beside them lay a field notebook smudged by graphite and skin. On the first page she recognized the handwriting before she read the word. Michael's initial curled the way it always curled when he wrote fast. Graphs marched across paper, notes in his tight style pattered along margins. Phrases leapt up, cavity period, coupling efficiency, response lag with weatherfront. A separate sheet had been tucked like a leaf, a neat plan labeled with tidy capitals. Near the corridor an arrow pointed toward the stone. 27-second pulse. Her throat tightened around the number. She could hear him say it, could see his lifted finger counting the space between beats. She set the notebook down and drew a steady breath. Anger passing, gratitude following, then the ache that made both feel extravagant. Sophie hovered in the doorway, eyes flicking from the case to her mother's face. Laura found a tone that imitated adventure. "Want to help me test the floor?" Sophie straightened. "If there's a monster we tell it we are not breakfast," she said almost smiling. They stepped into the main room. Laura placed the geophone's sensor on the stone and clicked the unit on. A red light winked. The needle stirred with each distant swell. She tried different points, taping numbered squares beside each. In the corridor where the wall felt too perfect, the needle deepened, not wilder, simply fuller, like a voice resonating inside a true chamber. She pictured a cavity beyond, the mountain's throat shaping a tone human skin could barely translate. On the hearth's lip, beneath a loose wedge, she found a cache, rolled tracings marked with smooth, unhurried handwriting she recognized as Warner's from old poster. He had drawn a honeycomb of voids beneath the house and marked a lattice with crystal symbols. Numbers flanked nodes, suggesting intervals more than distances. Along one edge, a different pen, a harder hand had scrawled, "Vent 2 sealed, monitor subsidence after rain." She flattened the tracings with mugs. The pulse swelled, held and emptied while she studied, its patient cadence pacing her attention. Sophie slid a small hand into hers. "Do you feel it here?" the girl asked. pointing at the seam at shoulder height in the corridor. Air thickened in that spot, like the moment before thunder when even leaves wait. Laura pressed her ear to the joint. The world narrowed to cool mineral and a distant throb. Under it hovered a thinner thread at the limit of hearing. They ate granola from enamel mugs, while Laura copied a portion of the plan into her notebook. A key soothed panic. A 4 cavity by corridor. B for shelf marks. C for instrument store. D for map cache. E for unknown aroma sweetening the recess. Lists turned fear into task. After breakfast she swept the floor, hoping specks might draw themselves into a path. Dust drifted in veils, and the house answered with that regular breath. Near the dining alcove she found a shallow closet, whose back panel did not sit quite flush. Painter's tape across the seam came back clean, as if someone had replaced that piece recently. Inside on a high shelf sat a canvas satchel stamped Warner in faded ink. Within it she found slide mounts in a tin, a slender flashlight for cave surveys, and a cloth-wrapped parcel that held a crystal cluster fused by resin to a plate. When she lifted it, the hum swelled as though a cello string had been brushed. They carried the satchel to the window slit for light. Sophie held the tin while Laura slid a mount into the tiny viewer. The first image showed a chamber where water lay black and perfect, surface unbroken except for a faint web of light radiating outward from a center. Another frame captured a wall of crystals arranged in lines like an instrument waiting for a hand. The third presented a close view of a notebook labeled Living Resonance Trials. The photograph had cropped the author, yet the pen beside it matched the one in the case. A sigh moved through the house, followed by that familiar swell. Sophie pressed her palm to her chest. "It's in me now," she said, startled by her own pulse trying to match the rhythm. Laura counted on her until fear softened. "Stone sings slowly," she said, and did not apologize for sounding fanciful. "Our bodies are excellent at borrowing a beat." Back in the recess, she powered the oscillograph and clipped one lead to the geophone's output, then trailed the other along the floor until the trace steadied into a repeating curve. The interval landed near 27 seconds, wobbling by tiny fractions depending on where she stood. She should have felt soothed by measurement. Instead her scalp prickled. The pattern proposed intention, even if logic refused to concede it. The last drawer she checked belonged to a low stone cabinet beneath the mantel. It stuck halfway, then came free with a scrape that echoed more than seemed fair. Inside lay an envelope addressed in block letters to L. Bennett. Her hands cooled. She broke the seal. A short note on graph paper held 2 sentences. "If you found this, I'm proud of your curiosity. Meet the cadence with patience, not force." The signature curled into a shape she had kissed 1,000 times. She set the note on the oscillograph and resisted reading it again. She needed to keep discoveries at arm's length, or drown in them. "Have you ever felt a place watching? Share your thoughts below." The line slipped out before she could stop it, half joke to thin the air and half invitation to name what was already true. Sophie's mouth twitched. "It's watching," she said, glancing toward the seam, "but maybe it wants to be friends." Laura smoothed a strand from her daughter's forehead. By late afternoon, rain eased, leaving the forest rinsed and bright while the lake remained indecently smooth. She labeled tape squares, packed instruments and set the crystal beside the trace. She repeated that what they felt was geology braided with weather and architecture, cavities under load, barometric shifts squeezing air through joints, water in a hidden pool breathing as temperature changed. Yet when she cupped her hands around the cluster, a faint shiver traveled into her wrists, and the oscillograph's trace rose a hair, as if answering. Sophie stepped back. "Mom?" she asked. Not afraid exactly, but unsettled in a way that made her voice smaller. Laura set the crystal down and clicked the lid of the case shut. The pulse continued, patient as ever. She could live with mystery, she told herself. She could. Then the needle on the geophone dipped and lifted in a motion that looked like a knot. Outside, a raven crossed the basin, wingbeats counting time no instrument could capture in that silence. Dusk laid a film over Lake Calo Basin, turning sky to graphite and water to obsidian. Laura unpacked the hard case, set the geophone on the floor, and ran leads to the seismograph, with the tired competence of someone who still knew where her skills lived, even after trying to bury them. Sophie lingered at the window slit, watching the lake. "It's holding its breath," she said. Laura flipped switches, watched a green line wake, and opened a notebook. The trace lifted, stalled, and rose again in a patient wave that returned every 27 seconds. She wrote the interval without writing the name that she wanted to live beside it. She moved the sensor in measured steps, taping labels at each placement. Near the dining alcove, the amplitude grew. Not wild, simply fuller, as though a throat opened under. In the corridor where the seam ran without imperfection, the signal was strongest, the curve rounding like a pulse red at the wrist. She sketched a map and penciled values. If she were at the lab, she would request a second unit, call a colleague, and file a preliminary note. Here she owned a house nobody wanted, and a silence that behaved like an equation. Night arrived with clean edges. The windows turned into aquarium glass, black outside, lamplight mirrored back. Sophie blew out tea lights until one lantern near the instruments remained. "Can we watch from the door?" Laura nodded. They stood beneath the overhang and breathed cold air that smelled of wet needles and iron. Wind combed the trees above, yet the basin stayed impossibly smooth. Then a glow rose beneath the surface, pale at first, then steadier, a faint aureole widening and shrinking with the very interval they had measured. Sophie whispered colors she invented: moon silver, smoke pearl, river glass, and counted the spaces with her fingers. Back inside, temperature held steady while pressure seemed to rise and ease in tandem with the signal. She noted the coupling, wrote a line about potential barometric influence, and drew a box around cavity resonance. On the mantel, Michael's photograph caught the lantern. She turned it face down, then turned it back, ashamed of the small relief. Sophie drifted along the corridor, pressing her palms to the stone. "It's louder here," she said at the seam. Laura bent, ear to rock. The vibration was not sound exactly, but rather a persuasion that urged the bone to listen. She measured again, the line answered with its slow handwriting across the screen. Modest scratches at regular spacing ran along the back of the lowest shelf, a detail that had bothered her since morning. She emptied it, slid her fingers along the base, and found a notch the size of a thumbnail. She pushed. Something clicked, quiet and definite. "Secret." Sophie breathed. Instantly younger. Laura hesitated. The field scientist inside her delighted at a hidden catch. The mother and the widow tasted fear. She wedged the shelf open with a mallet handle and sent light into the gap. Behind the wood sat an iron plate flush to the stone, unpainted, cold even in the warmed room. Its edge ran straight along the floor and up the wall to the seam, then across and down, a rectangle masked by carvings. Near the bottom right, a keyway lay disguised inside a decorative rose. She lifted the seismograph, set the sensor before the lip, and watched the response swell until it nearly clipped the scale. "This is the source," she said before she could stop herself. The words hung like a claim she did not want. Sophie's eyes brightened. "Can we open it?" Laura pictured the envelope addressed to her, Michael's curved signature, Warner's tracings of honeycomb voids, the note about sealed vents, and her own resignation letter, 4 facts with 1 bruise. "Not yet," she said. "We need to understand more than a number." Procedure steadied her hands. She checked the airflow with a match. The flame stood straight, then leaned toward the seam when the pulse rose, then straight again. Very slight exchange, probably tied to the cycle. She noted. She tapped the plate at intervals with a rubber hammer, listening for changes in tone. A dull ring on the left, deeper center slightly higher to the right. She drew a small diagram. She checked structural surrounds. No fresh spalls, no hairline cracks, no damp halo. The house was careful, but not careless. The glow under the lake returned, brighter now, as though night had taught it courage. Sophie reported each swell, voice lifting despite the hour. The trace rippled in sync with the distant flare, not with footsteps. Laura wrote that correlation demands caution and still felt its hook. She powered the compact oscillograph, clipped the geophone output, and watched the repeating curve draw itself with priestly patience. The interval held. If an external driver existed, it was not wind, not traffic, not loose piping. She imagined a cavity below, a mineral lattice, weather leaning on pressure the way a hand leans on a drumhead, shaping a tone skin could barely translate. She crouched and brushed dust from the keyway with the tip of a paintbrush. The slot was notched, narrow, fashioned for a tool that either lived nearby or had been carried away. She looked at the satchel. The cloth parcel of crystal still sat benign, though the trace rose a hair when she reached toward it, then returned. The effect could have been a coincidence. Coincidence ruled until it didn't. Sophie came back from the door, solemn again. "If it's a secret door, Maybe it wants something, she said. Like a password. Laura smiled despite herself. Rock understands pressure better than words. She tried steady pressure at likely hinges. The way cave gates sometimes demanded an angle rather than force. The plate gave nothing but chill. The hour bent late. She brewed tea, put honey in 1 cup and set it beside the map. The hum invaded even quiet sips, an insistent patience that would not loosen. She thought of Michael in the field, half-shadow over a lantern, voice low, while he turned a pencil between graphite-smudged fingers. He had believed in pausing more than pushing. His note had said patience, not force. She closed the case and let the instrument run unattended, while she listened to the interval with her eyes shut, counting without numbers. They dozed in shallow pockets and woke together when a stutter rode the line, not a spike, a hiccup. The lake flared, dimmed, and flared again, then settled into its grave cadence. The scene warmed, a radiance that did not belong to stone. It felt like standing near a sleeping animal, powerful and indifferent, unlikely to roll but capable of it. She did not open the door. Instead she laid out steps for the morning, recheck the interval at multiple points, verify coupling against pressure drift, carry the geophone outside to test for a distant driver, search again for a key shaped like a question the slot might answer. She wrote the list twice, once for discipline and once to calm. Sophie read over her shoulder. "Will we go in there?" the girl asked. Laura gave the careful truth. "We will go when we know how to come back." The lake kept its glass. The mountain held its breath. The door waited with unsentimental patience, while a woman measured caution against need, grief against inquiry, love against the ache to know why a number she had counted all day sounded like a voice she once trusted in the dark. Laura waited until the second hitch rolled through the trace, and the lake's faint corona settled back into its unearthly calm. Measurement had given certainty without meaning. Numbers kept orbiting the same question. She tucked Sophie deeper into her bag, kissed her hair, and returned to the corridor where an iron plate hid behind a carved ornament. Michael's note had said patience, not force. She brushed dust from the rosette, pressed mapped points, and felt a concealed tumbler ease. A soft inner latch shifted as if the mountain exhaled. She braced the lantern on a shelf, set the seismograph where the signal ran fullest, and listened as the interval lapped against stone. 27 seconds. The plate lifted on a slow hinge. Cool air moved past her shins, scented with mineral sweetness and a hint of beeswax that should not have lived underground. She wrote nothing. She entered. A narrow stair dropped, each step carved to take weight without argument. Chalk lines stitched the wall. She counted the slow pulse to 27 and moved when it ended. As though joining a cue the mountain kept. The hum deepened. Names appeared at elbow height. Warner, dated twice, and lower, an initial M that tightened her chest. The stairs widened into a chamber that felt both crafted and inevitable. Benches rose from bedrock. Copper braces held shelves. A compact console built from salvaged panels sat beneath a rack of tuning forks labeled by frequency. Crystal arrays stood on pedestals. Quartz clear as river ice. Green fluorite tight as grapes. Smoky prisms laced with needles. Oilcloth bundles lined a niche. The air trembled at the edge of hearing, not sound, more persuasion. She loosened the twine on the first bundle. The notebook inside opened to Michael's handwriting. Clean numbers, quick sketches, midnight asides. He had mapped a honeycomb under the house, contoured voids and marked a repeating interval. He and Warner logged trials with a care that honored failure as much as success. One term kept returning: entrainment, sympathy, alignment, until a paragraph allowed the phrase that would have sounded ridiculous anywhere else: living resonance. Laura sat very still. She turned pages. A diagram labeled cavities. A through G linked pressure, humidity and temperature to response. Another showed a rig nicknamed Heartline. A sensor pad at the carotid. An amplifier. A coupling plate under a latch. Warner wrote like a patient teacher. Michael wrote like a man excited and afraid to be right. A storm entry noted coupling beyond prediction. A margin line in darker pencil said grief spikes the field, joy steadies it. The hum pressed at her ribs, inviting attention without demand. She approached the nearest array, a crown of clear quartz on a copper frame. A small card in Warner's hand read, "Touch is consent. Begin with 2 fingers, breathe. She raised her hand, paused a centimeter above the crystal, then made contact with the lightest pressure skin can register. She counted 4 slow breaths. The lattice answered. Light rose from within the quartz, not flash, but tide. It moved along hidden veins, sank to the frame, traveled the wire and returned as a shimmer that matched the chamber's beat, then matched her own. She pressed a fraction harder. The glow quickened, then steadied when she steadied. Her pulse climbed and dropped, and the stone followed like a careful partner learning steps. Panic tried to enter. She named it, breathed, and watched it lose leverage. Wonder remained. She lifted her head. The glow settled into an ember-ready patience. Michael's parentheses lingered on the page. He had worked without telling her, not from exclusion, but because he feared what hope would do if it failed. She knew that fear. She opened another notebook. Warner's entries carried the other half of the conversation, cautions about reciprocity, diagrams of lattice topologies that avoided stress, a sentence circled twice, do not command, invite alignment. Margins bore Michael's darker pencil, try music with pulse-locked percussion, test spoken names, record after sleep. A later page included a line that made her blink. Laura's laugh recorded on the ridge system brightened without prompting. She tried the console. Switches wore sober labels: source, gate, pad, coupler. One toggle had been replaced by a red button nicked to gray. A shallow drawer stuck, then gave. Inside lay an offset tooth key and an envelope stamped, state property. The draft letter to a board promised structural health insights, therapy and research if discretion was held. In pencil, Michael had added a way to help people survive themselves. She tucked the key into her pocket. On a high shelf, a tin of slides shared space with a view. The first showed the lake under a new moon, a pale halo breathing underwater. The second pictured a ribcage lattice on a ceramic plate. The third captured a notebook titled Heartline beside a sensor pad. Annotations correlated brightness with tiny interval drifts, the sort only a patient person would notice. Pride warmed her despite the cold. The hum thickened with the sense of weather gathering above. She touched a smaller array of fluorite. Copper taste climbed her tongue, and prisms filled with a soft interior rain. She set a tuning fork singing. The glow dipped, then returned unimpressed. Consent, not command. Invitation, not force. A journal near the bottom tied beauty to danger. During one storm, a spike built quietly and did not release for hours. Afterward, the lake kept glowing while instruments upstairs read calm. Warner wrote, "The field mirrors what we bring and keeps its own will." Michael underlined will 3 times and drew a lopsided heart that made Laura smile and ache together. She set her fingers again on the quartz crown, warmth braided with the mountain's cold. The glow met. She thought of Sophie asleep with fossils at the sill, of beach days inside the cracked photo, of the auction clerk who barely looked up when a ruined woman bought a cave for the price of a chair. The chamber listened without pity. It offered a mirror that did not flatter or scold. It simply reflected. Her voice came small and steady. What would you do if you found a secret tied to someone you lost? Let us know in the comments. The room accepted the question and changed nothing, which felt right. This was not a set. It was a conversation with materials that tolerated love and fear as energies, both dangerous when hidden, both useful when named. Lantern dimming, she circled once more. The lab asked for responsibility, not worship. She took the key and letter, closed the drawer and traced chalk back to the stairs. Mechanisms yielded with less resistance, as if repetition had taught the hinge to trust. At the threshold, she looked back. Plates shone like low coals. Copper held the lantern as a thin rivet. The quartz seemed to sleep with one eye open, alert to the next question. She slid the iron into place without locking it, honoring boundary and invitation at once. Upstairs, Sophie rolled and reached for her in sleep. Laura lay beside her daughter and counted her breaths, then the patient interval under the floor, and felt the 2 lines drift closer without touching. Between them lived possibility, terror and a kind of hope she could carry because it demanded work rather than belief. Outside, the lake held its impossible poise while rain moved the forest, and the house, awake at last, kept time with their joined quiet. Wind came early, low and unsettled, combing the pines above the cliff until the forest sounded like surf caught in needles. Laura woke to the hum already larger, pressing against cheekbones and lungs as if the house had grown restless overnight. The seismograph's line, left running on the low table, no longer drew its calm stare. Intervals held at 27 seconds while amplitudes leapt, staggered and climbed again in jagged steps that tightened the skin at her wrists. She checked power, leads, ground clip, baseline drift, then tapped the casing the way old field hands did when they wanted a machine to confess. It confessed nothing, only traced the same impatient rise. Sophie sat up, hair wild, eyes bright with that serious kindness children show when they decide to help. "It's breathing louder," she whispered, sliding to the narrow window. The lake below wore dawn like graphite on glass. A pale ring pulsed under the surface, widening, shrinking, widening again in sympathy with the unreadable mood under the floor. "Breathing," Laura echoed, tasting the word. It fit too well. She noted time barometer, humidity and wind direction. Clouds banked above the ridge, their bellies greened by a storm still assembling itself. She brewed coffee to steady her hands and made the motions slow on purpose, measured scoops, small flame, careful stir. The next pulse shoved the lantern's chimney hard enough to sing. Dust quivered along the tape squares she had placed yesterday. The geophone's needle tilted near the stop. "If anything changes too fast we step back," she said. Sophie nodded, mouth a thin line that echoed Michael's when he listened hard. Another spike rose, another followed, taller. At the corridor seam, heat leaked as if a sleeping animal had turned in its den. She pressed her palm to the stone and felt a ripple meet the heel of her hand, not painful, only insistent. The hidden plate stayed latched with the memory of last night's opening. She did not test it. The urge to go down fought with the recognition that she had already taken more than she understood. Her chest tightened and the trace jumped in tidy sympathy. She stilled. "The jump is smooth." Michael's margin line returned in the simplest handwriting he owned. "Grief spikes the field. Joy steadies it." Wind punched the ridge. First rain ticked on the overhang. Sap scent swelled in the draft. The lake's glow strengthened. Not bright exactly, yet undeniable. A steady aureole answering every cycle. Sophie counted under her breath, fingers tracking swells. 27, 27, 27. A charm made of integers. Thunder muttered far off, still throat clearing. The house answered with a heavier push. Frames rattled, then settled. Laura carried the geophone to the threshold and set it under the rock. The trace stayed unruly, but lost a thin edge of frenzy. Back inside, the jag teethed again. Whatever carried the pattern preferred their warmth, maybe even rode the air they disturbed by worrying. A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with temperature. Emotion acted as a gain. Denial would not reduce volume. She had resigned to outrun that math. The math had followed her into stone. She spread Warner's tracings and Michael's notes across the table. Heartline diagram. Consent, not command. Invite alignment. Another caution. Storms amplify. Step back from threshold. A later page. If compelled to stay, regulate breath. Speak names you trust. Lower voice. She laughed once without humor. Speak names you trust. The only one she trusted steadied and broke her in equal measure. She laid a finger over the word will that Warner had circled, then moved her hand away before memory sharpened into harm. Sophie returned from the door, rain glittering in her hair like tiny scales. "The water's breathing faster," she said. "It wants some." Laura wanted to argue. Swap want for respond. Intent for mechanism. Myth for model. Thunder rolled again, closer now, pacing the interval in a way that made coincidence feel theatrical. The oscillograph drew its patient traces with small stutters that did not belong. The seam warmed further, a quiet radiance through stone, neither invitation nor warning, only presence. Lightning walked the far ridge, a white vein briefly exposing the mountain's bone. The follow-on crack shook the overhang hard enough to sift dust from a high joint. The trace surged. She steadied her breathing and asked Sophie to count her own pulse. Inside wrist. Close your eyes. Don't chase the other beat. They counted together. The line calmed a fraction. Laura named leaves, lakes she had mapped, colleagues who would tease her for letting folk language into her log. Anything to keep speech simple and slow. "Okay," she said at last. Not to storm, not to rock, not to memory, but to her own stubborn fear. "We acknowledge." She spoke lower with each sentence following Warner's instruction. "We hear you. We won't force." She shut the drawer with the crystal cluster and kept her hands off every array. Respect felt like a valve she could actually operate. Some jags smoothed. Not all. Rain thickened from needles to cords. The basin disappeared behind a falling sheet. Even so, the center refused to pucker. Glow held with stoic discipline. Wind harmonized with the interval until the room felt like a drum played with two hands, one steady, one reckless. Sophie squeezed her finger. "We should go downstairs," she said. "Or leave." Laura looked at the iron door, then at the road. A slide here would erase retreat. The only safe path was stabilization. She dimmed lamps to reduce internal reflection, opened the entry a hand's width to adjust pressure, and weighted the seamed shelf with books so it could not shift without telling them. She set blankets, water and the kit within. Then she sat cross-legged and placed the geophone beside her knee like a companion. She guided Sophie into a cadence that matched neither storm nor chamber. "In for 4, hold for 2, out for 6, she said softly. The child obeyed with fierce concentration, jaw set, eyes damp but steady. Wind screamed along the ridge and tore a branch loose. It clattered down the cliff like thrown bones. The interval held even as the amplitude kept misbehaving. She stopped outrunning the phrase living resonance and accepted its plain implication. The lab's cautions had not been superstition, they had been field notes with human variables named because pretending otherwise would kill someone. She lowered her voice further. "Michael," she said. Not as pleading, not as ritual, simply as a name spoken to a memory that steadied her. The house shuddered once, then settled. Glow thickened, then eased into discipline. Warner's instruction returned. "Speak names you trust. Then stop and breathe." She did. Sophie peered up with a brave, drawn face. "Is it working?" "Enough," Laura said. "Enough to carry this hour." Thunder planted itself over them, and bellowed down the mountain's throat. The seam heated until warmth bled through her sleeve. She rose, placed both palms flat without pressing, and waited. The field met her hands like a river that preferred bending to breaking. Force would split that flow. Patience. Let it draw a new line. Breath steadied again here. Thunder ran along the ridge as the chamber behind the hidden plate answered with a deeper strain rising through Laura's forearms. She kept the breath cadence she and Sophie had practiced, refused panic, and the latch yielded. Underground air slid past her cheeks, mineral cool, faintly honeyed. "Stay on the stairs," she said. Sophie nodded, fingers around the bedrock rail. Lantern low, Laura stepped through. The stair carried their pulse downward. Warner's chalk marks glowed in weak light. With each step, the interval swelled, 27 measured heartbeats of mountain time sliding into human ribs. At the landing the lab felt awake. Quartz crowns smoldered. Copper frames murmured against screws. She approached the largest lattice, the rib cage of prisms labeled consent array. The card said, "Touch is agreement, invite alignment." Light brightened even before contact. Fear climbed her throat. She looked back at Sophie and found the steadiness she had borrowed earlier. Laura raised 2 fingers, paused and set them on the nearest facet. Light rose like a tide through the glass, ran along the veins to the copper ring, split, met itself and climbed until the crown carried a pulse swinging between the chamber beat and her quick one. She kept counting. The light matched her, then met the deeper cadence, then found a third path where both could live. Sadness loosened from a knot near her sternum and drifted toward her hands. The glow brightened with that release, exactly as Michael's notes had implied. The room sharpened. Michael stood within the same air, not a ghost, but memory with enough fidelity to borrow the lantern. He wore his field jacket, pockets heavy with pencils and a folded sheet. Warner moved beside him, slight, intent, lamp bright on an earnest face. Their words did not reach her, yet cadence and gesture translated. Warner pointed at the lattice, then at the door and drew a slow circle as if reminding future readers to breathe. Michael set his palm on a smaller array with near reverence. He glanced at Warner, then toward a ceiling that was not the ceiling she saw now, as if older light hung there. Laura's throat closed and opened. "Hi," she whispered before restraint. The lattice under her fingertips answered with a tiny flare that felt like a squeeze offered across a crowd. She had expected fresh sorrow. What arrived felt like posture. Her shoulders lowered, her spine rose. A crack split the ridge. The trace jumped, then re-entered, thrumming like an instrument forced past tolerance. The consent array flashed, dimmed, flashed again. She pictured joints loosening, waveforms running wild, until the chamber knocked the house off its bed. She wanted to pull away. Warner's ring around did not stop her. She lengthened her breath and angled her fingers so contact became listening rather than grip. "I'm with you," she said, and meant it in two directions. She placed her other hand on a second prism. Another pulse climbed, warmer, wider, and the field folded her fingers into its timing, the way surf takes ankles and then lets them go. In that swing, she saw more. Michael tracing chalk, circling a pressure node, shaking his hand when the pencil bit. Warner whispered a calculation and smiled when the sum landed kinder than expected. Lightning drew a blue blade through the slit above, and the chamber picked that cut color up, then softened it into milk. She named fear, then remembered Michael's grocery line jokes. His habit of overcautious knots, his way of buying batteries in pairs because someone always forgets one. Ordinary days steadied her more than myths. The glow steadied with her. Sophie took one step. Laura lifted a palm, not a command, pure request. "Talk to him," Sophie said. Voice thin yet bright. "Even if he isn't here the way we want." Laura laughed once. Quick and straight. She whispered anyway, words careful as bolts. "I'm sorry I left the work you loved without goodbye. I'm sorry I shoved my notebooks into boxes like they bit. I'm grateful you wrote down my laugh. I hear you asking me to breathe." A transverse tremor moved underfoot, shorter than the main rhythm, like a dropped tool skittering. The lattice did not flicker. It leaned into the smaller jag until the two waves folded and emerged as something that could pass. She realized she had an altered habit. Earlier she would have hunted a switch, closed a valve and killed power. Now she chose presence. Guilt that always trailed competence eased, not gone, yet softened enough to care. Another vision arrived. The two men at this array, younger, eager, arguing kindly about whether to tune to breath or to steel. Warner laughed, stepped back, and motioned for patience. Michael winked and let the lattice choose by doing less. The glow Laura felt that wink like a coin pressed into her palm by someone sprinting for a train. The storm crested. Water hammered the overhang until the sound became a sheet. The field swung wide, and for a sliver she feared she had asked too much by merely standing inside. The roof would cough loose. The cliff would shed. The lake would throw off its skin. "Not force," she said. Invitation. Her hands softened. The light dimmed to a sustainable burn. Sophie took another step. The crystals near the stairs brightened. "Can I touch one?" she asked. "One finger," Laura said, "and copy my breath." The child stretched, touched the smallest prism with reverence, and fell into the count like a dancer recalling marks. The interval held. Erratic stutters lined up as textures inside the larger wave. Laura rested her forehead on the back of her hand. She saw Michael teaching freshmen to read a noisy trace without brutalizing it with filters. She saw Warner arranging stamps on a grant envelope like a mosaic to order Charm's reviewer. She saw herself laughing at nothing important, and both men looking up, then pretending they had not, shy around delights they did not cause. Have you ever felt a loved one's presence in a moment of crisis? Share your story below. The sentence left her simply, not as bait, not as performance, but as an admission that she was not the only person learning to steer with absence at the wheel. She felt the storm lean on the mountain as pressure drummed through the benches and up her arms. A steady insistence asking for an answer rather than surrender. Michael's presence gathered like warmth near her shoulder, not weight, only guide. She matched breath to the gentle roll beneath the floor until fear thinned to respect and respect to resolve. She spoke his name once and the pulse lifted without violence, as though the array were tipping its hat. The glow brightened in pace with grief when memories pressed. Hospitals, calls, the box of plain language that closed a life and softened when love replaced panic. A proof she had never expected to witness with instruments at her feet. Lightning fractured again, far closer, yet the chamber kept to its cadence. Michael's jacket rustled in the vision. He set a fingertip on the air above the array, not touching the crystal, showing restraint, asking her to meet the system with the same dignity he had shown every stubborn question. She decided to learn the slow language rather than treat it like a riddle to crack. Her fingertips cooled, the light gentled to coal heat, and the room exhaled a quiet she had not felt since before the accident. When the pulse arrived, she kept still, felt the lattice choose calm over flare, and knew the house had heard promise to care for secret. When she lifted her hands, the glow did not vanish. It declined to a hum of coals, faithful, patient. The storm eased by degree. Water kept speaking on stone, and the ridge's voice fell from shout to murmur. Laura backed toward the stairs, still facing the arrays, still breathing with the interval. Sophie reached for her. Their fingers met. At the threshold she saw the photograph in her pocket as if held in the lantern circle. 3 bodies laughing into the sun, salt on their lips, wind meant to hair, a day catalogued by nothing except joy. She tucked the memory under her tongue the way Michael used to tuck a pencil behind his ear. Then she eased the plate until the latch kissed home. Upstairs the lake's glow softened to a halo no brighter than breath on glass. "He's proud," Sophie said. Laura did not ask how she knew. She set the instruments to log, poured water and rested her forehead against cool stone that felt not like a wall but like a hand laid gently across a racing mind. Dawn arrived like a quiet pact between weather and stone. The storm had raged and then thinned, and now rain traced the cliff in silver threads that could not quite let go. Laura sat cross-legged on the floor with the geophone near her knee. Sophie wrapped in a blanket by the window slit, and the hidden plate sealed behind its carvings. The hum still moved through the house, softer than night yet steady, carrying the same 27-second patience that had followed them since arrival. She thought of leaving the arrays asleep forever, then felt the rhythm press at her cheekbones like a reminder that refusal is different from rest. She chose steadiness over defiance. She chose breath. "Copy me," she said. "In for 4. Hold for 2. Out for Sophie nodded, and settled into the cadence with the calm focus she used when sorting fossils. Outside, the basin looked newly washed, trees dripping, mist banding the opposite ridge. The lake's halo had faded to a pale idea, yet the intervals still nudged bone with polite insistence. Laura moved to the seam along the corridor and placed her palm on the stone. Heat answered with a measured rise and fall that belonged to the place rather than the weather. She pictured the chamber below and the quartz crowns resting like banked coals. Michael's margin line returned. Grief spikes the field, joy steadies it. Plain as chalk. She breathed until her shoulders dropped. The trace on the oscillograph slimmed into a clean loop, amplitude tapering while the interval held. When a small spike tried to lift, she softened her jaw and let it pass through without feeding it. "We will visit," she told Sophie, "but we will not force. We will be kind," Sophie said, and the answer felt like a key. They opened the plate together. The latch yielded with a courteous sigh. Lantern low they descended. Warner's chalk marks kept their shy grammar along the wall and the chamber met them with a warmth that fell short of heat yet carried the friendliness of a hand not withdrawn. Laura approached the largest lattice and set 2 fingers on a clear facet. She placed her other hand over her heart as if closing a circuit through body and stone. "Breathe in. Hold, breathe out." At first the crystal took her cadence like a student, then the glow rose in the lattice and began to match, slipped toward the deeper beat that belonged to the mountain and found a third path where both could live. The hum in the room rounded its edges and stopped leaning hard. Her pulse slowed without strain. She felt watched, not by a ghost but by attention itself. Stone, water, air and the careful instruments the 2 men had left. She kept breathing until the lights steadied into coals. A memory stepped forward and did not turn sharply. Michael is on the porch with a chipped mug, reading notes to the rain. She let the scene cross the room and then leave. The lattice brightened a fraction, then settled. She understood the simple law: the system did not reward denial. It answered composure. Feelings were currents. Channels made them safe. She did not chase visions. She offered steadiness and invited alignment. Sophie stood near the smallest array, hands tucked into her sleeves as if honoring a small ceremony. "It likes calm," the child whispered. "We can make that," Laura replied. She lifted a tuning fork once and let it fade. The glow did not flinch. Consent, not command. Above them the last gusts thinned. The roof stopped complaining. The ridge climbed down from a shout to a murmur. On the instruments the jagged strokes lost their teeth, then drew narrow hills with gentle shoulders. The house adjusted beside their bodies, learning a better pace. Laura traced the heartline diagram in her head and saw the coupler as a polite mediator rather than a lever. She spoke Michael's name once without pleading, as one speaks to a companion across a river who knows the route by smell. The field did not flare. It answered with a patient yes that lived in timing rather than sound. "Thank you," she said to the lattice, to the air and to the rock. The crystals accepted gratitude as if it were correct, not extravagant. She set the recorder to log and penciled a line: stabilization by matched heartbeat and breath. Amplitude falls when attention widens. Interval constant. Invitation sustains. Forcing fail. She closed the notebook and left the crown glowing like a hearth left safe for the night. They climbed. The lake met them with a surface that finally accepted the breeze. Ripples ran toward the cliff, broke into chevrons and fell back into pat. Sun pressed through ragged clouds and set wet needles sparkling as if the forest were newly minted. The halo under the water receded to a whisper. The hum retreated to the edge of awareness, audible when sought, respectful when ignored. Laura poured cocoa while Sophie wiped the sill dry with the sleeve of an old shirt. They ate toast with honey and let silence do the heavy lifting that words cannot sustain. The photograph on the mantel no longer asked to be turned down. It could watch them watch the. Laura touched cool stone and felt a pulse meet her hand with affectionate delay, like a friend arriving on time by an older clock. They tended small damage as the weather gave them back the hours it had taken. A latch needed tightening, a hook wanted a new a drip near the pantry seam yielded to wax thread and patience. Work stitched the morning into keepable fabric. She found herself humming the meandering tune Michael used to tease. Sophie laughed at the wrong notes and then at the laugh, multiplying light without sliding into sugar. The lake held a subtle sheen, proof that mystery had not departed, only learned manners. Afternoon leaned in with pewter, giving way to diluted gold. The house smelled of tea, minerals and that faint sweetness that had greeted them on day one. In the corridor, Laura pressed her palm to the stone again. The field answered with a friendly rise and a patient fall. She whispered a promise to keep breath honest and inquiry clean. The plate's latch kissed shut and stayed. Nothing begged, nothing boundary and belonging stood side by side like neighboring trees that know where roots touch but never tangle. At dusk they carried blankets to the threshold, and sat where the overhang framed the basin like a stage. The last stain of glow under water faded to memory. "Do you think he knows?" Sophie asked. Laura folded wool over both their knees. "Love does not leave," she said, surprised to hear the sentence arrive with belief. She did not need a vision or a voice. The room below, the rock around, the measured interval, and the way her chest unknotted, whenever she chose alignment felt like letters in a word she finally knew how to read. She took Sophie's hand and kept the count that had become a quiet prayer. "What brings you peace after long? Tell us in the comments." The question left her mouth like a lantern she intended for strangers and herself, an invitation to name practices that turn absence into a shape the living can carry. Ripples touched the cliff and vanished. Wind threaded pine crowns with a softer voice. An owl tried a note, then another, pleased with the second. Laura closed the log and set it where morning light could find it. Night arrived without threat. The hum stayed, not as an alarm, not as a test, but as a companionable tick beneath everything. She breathed once more with the cadence she had taught and felt the crystals answering like coals ready to warm without demanding explanation. The mountain held them the way an old friend holds a promise they heard clearly the first time and never needed repeat. She trimmed the lantern, tucked the blanket higher around Sophie's shoulders, and let the house list its quiet inventory of sounds. Drip, twig, distant wing, a kettle sound. She understood at last that survival was not a sprint away from grief, but a practice of returning to balance every time the field tried to tilt. She would test, record and repair. She would protect the arrays from superstition and from hunger. She would keep the door closed when closing was care, and open it when listening was asked for hands. She would live here, not to control a wonder, but to keep it in company until the mountain chose another keeper. Sophie slept. The lake exhaled. The house breathed with them, gentle and exact, and the night folded itself into a rest that did not erase anything and did not need to. She slept, and the mountain kept time. Morning slipped across Lake Calo Basin in pale bands, touching the cliff before it reached the water, and then sliding into the windows as if asking permission. Laura moved through the rooms with a pencil behind her ear and a coil of twine on her wrist, logging drips, drafts and small repairs that needed nothing more than patience and a screwdriver. Sophie followed with a bucket of nails, a folded cloth and a grin that arrived at the wrong moments and made them both laugh. They tightened a hinge that had clicked through the storm, relashed a shutter, and coaxed a stubborn latch to accept a thin smear of wax. The hum below their feet kept its respectful cadence, no longer pushing at bone, simply ticking like a distant clock remembering duty. From the slit window the lake showed a slow ripple that looked honest again. A faint glow remained one layer down, not dramatic, only a reminder that the mountain held errance without intrusion. Outside, the path along the cliff wore the night's weather in a necklace of wet needles. They swept the overhang, stacked fallen twigs for kindling, and reset the metal catch on the rain barrel so it would not stick when the next front came through. Breeze carried resin and cold stone. A raven perched near the ridge and clicked its tongue as though scolding them for arriving late to maintenance. Sophie shaded her eyes and watched the reflections crease and smooth. "It is calmer," she said, but it remembers. Laura squeezed her hand and agreed with a quiet hum. They walked the perimeter with a deliberate pace, breathing with the interval they could now feel without counting. Far off, sun combed thin mist and found the wet crowns of firs, turning each needle into a pin of bright metal. Laura checked anchor points along the ledge, tested the drain near the entry and sketched a place where a handrail should run so Sophie could move safely in rain and snow. She marked a stone that wanted reseeding and a seam that would benefit from fresh mortar when the air dried. Work stitched the morning into keepable fabric. Inside, the geophone rested on the shelf, the oscillograph tracing a disciplined loop that could have passed for a resting heartbeat. Laura dated the graph and taped it into a ledger salvaged from a box in the utility recess. On a fresh page she summarized the night's lesson in language so simple it would survive doubt: match breath, touch lightly, widen attention, never command. She added a line to honor the living, safeguard while curious, report with care. Then she drew a small square to mark her promise and shaded it until graphite shone. Sophie read the lines and without prompting wrote a rule of her own: listen first. In the afternoon they opened the plate and descended, not to push, only to confirm that the arrays had settled as responsibly as the instruments above implied. The chamber met them with a glow no brighter than banked coals under ash. Laura set 2 fingers on the clear crown and matched Kate. The light answered with the steady rise and fall they had earned. She greeted the room, thanked the miners who had carved the first hollows, and named the 2 researchers who had taught restraint by example. She thanked Michael for writing what mattered when language was difficult. Then she stepped back and let stillness do its work. Sophie stood near the smallest prism like an acolyte who knows ceremony is mostly patience. Evening came with copper pooling at the horizon and cold slipping into shade. They hung blankets across the entry, simmered soup and mended a strap on a pack that would carry gear when the weather settled. Laura laid out a rotation for tasks that would keep the dwelling healthy: mornings for checks, midday for notes, late hours for reading until lamplight asked them to stop. The lake outside subsided into a tempered mirror that allowed a sky stitched with thin cloud to pass without comment. Under that skin a mild sheen persisted, a heartbeat seen through cloth rather than a beacon. Sophie placed fossils along the sill in a careful row and whispered the names she had memorized. Laura wrote final notes by lantern at the table hewn from a single slab. She described the storm and the way the field had mirrored everything brought to it: fear, care, breath and name, and how the lattice chose calm when invited rather than driven. She recorded small victories with the same seriousness that once sized faults: a hinge that no longer clicked, a child who could count without racing, a mind that could finish a sentence without breaking. She listed plans that would honor both science and humility. She would draft a private ethics sheet, diagram safe ranges, label every switch and mark the words to avoid when emotion ran hot. She would build a cover for the console, not to hide it, but to remind any future keeper that access begins with responsibility. She added a margin line that made her smile without pain: keep tea near the log. Sophie fell asleep with wool to her chin and knuckles against the agate that caught lampfire. The house answered with a hum that had become intimate without turning possessive, a rhythm that respected door. Laura stood in the corridor and pressed her palm to the stone. The field met skin and eased again, as if nodding. She breathed once for Michael, once for Warner, once for the stranger who would inherit this duty after she learned how to teach it. She was a keeper, not a queen. A participant, not an owner. The lake, polite now, let wind write small lines across its face and then erased them gently. Before bed she stepped beneath the overhang and listened to night gather. An owl tested a phrase and liked the second note. A fox stitched the slope with quiet pause. The basin carried every sound with clarity that made whisper and leaf equal. Stars came through in shy handfuls. The faint underwater sheen held its place like a lighthouse turned down to a heartbeat, visible only to those who looked long enough. She whispered a promise to keep breath honest, to measure before naming, to open when listening asked for hands, and to close when care demanded a boundary. Back inside she smoothed the page and signed with a hand that no longer trembled. Then she looked up at the small camera perched on the mantel, a simple device that would carry this account to anyone who might need an invitation to calm. Her voice grew warm. She thanked the audience that had walked the ridge with them, named the modest tools that made survival feel like craft, and left room for silence to do its part. She glanced at Sophie sleeping near the lantern's last glow, and then returned to the lens with a steady gaze. She spoke to those who chase answers, to those who mourn without maps, to those who have stood in front of a locked door and felt a pulse on the other side. She told them that patience is not passivity, that listening can turn danger into dialogue, and that some places will meet you halfway if you approach with care. She asked them to think of their own basins, not always carved from stone, sometimes hidden inside a chest that has waited years for breath to slow. Stay with us as quiet questions find answers slowly. She closed the ledger, set the pen across its spine and lifted the camera one final time. Outside, wind smoothed the lake until it looked like silk pulled taut across a frame. The glow beneath had thinned to a thread, a quiet awareness rather than a call. She smiled, not because the mystery had ended, but because it had learned manners and she had learned how to keep company with. Then she offered the last line the way one offers a lantern to travelers on a dark path, bright enough to carry, humble enough to accept refusal. What happened next will shock you. Subscribe to find out and share this story with someone who loves a mystery.